Welcome to the Rock and Roll Rowdies. Okay, tonight we're going to have a bit of a special review of Mr. Alan Grange's background and myself. I'll be catching up in a little while. But let's hear from Granny, from where he came from. Look where he is now.
And where I am now. Yeah, so I'm coming to you live from the foothills of Monrovia, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. I've lived here for the last 40-something years. But back in the beginning, Mal Craggs, who was one of the other rowdies, dragged me kicking and screaming to a rehearsal in Hartlepool of this band. I had no real interest in bands up to that point, but did the first few gigs around town, got into it. Next thing you know, we'd moved to London in 1969 with the same band from Hartlepool. We did a few things around the city, but then eventually I realized if I was going to do this, I suddenly got a taste of professionalism, got to move forward a little. So I answered an advert in either the New Musical Express or the Melody Maker for a roadie wanted £10 a week, live with the band. Yeah. Some experience might be necessary, might be useful. I had some experience. So that was the legendary prog rock band Gnidrolog. And next thing you know, one of the first gigs was the Wheelie Festival, which was one of the first big open air festivals in the early 70s. And then continued on through bands like Vinegar Joe, Vandergraaf Generator, the Heavy Metal Kids, Average White Band, Zoot Money and Steve Ellis, and Stack Ridge, English quirky bands. Then I got involved with Steel Eye Span. We did a first United States and world tour, wow, which led on to made all kinds of contacts, led on to, I came back from that.
How old were you then, Granny?
How old was I? My first American tour, I was 25. My first rock and roll gig, I was 21.
Right, okay.
20, moved to London, 20, just turned 21. But in 1974, started making contacts in the American side of things. People like Chip Monk, who was the production manager for Woodstock. These guys were big thinkers, and he recruited me to do the George Foreman Muhammad Ali fight concert in Zaire in September. That was something else. That deserves a whole chapter on its own. Came back from that, and I started becoming an independent sort of. I was never a production. I was always like a guy that would get into whatever was needed. And I did some stuff with the Warner Brothers Music Tour, which was 6 bands over 2 nights, all tour around Europe in 75. Reconnected with Wishbone Ash and Mal. And we started touring in the States with Wishbone. Came back and did a big, 1975, did a huge European tour called Star Trucking.
Right.
Bankrupt Miles Copeland. Yeah. Mark was on that, the sound man for Wishbone. We all know each other in this little gang. Then I continued on with people like Bette Midler. Bette Midler was fantastic. Call me sometime, Bette. We need to talk. And Supertramp, Chris de Burgh, bands like the Divinals, Underworld. I got involved in like getting bands off the ground over here as opposed to working with big time bands. As great as that can be, I enjoyed the kind of working with people that were still keen, you know. Then my last real rock and roll gig was in the 90s with the legendary Led Zeppelin music, reggae style with an Elvis impersonator, and they were brilliant. I loved them. It was perfect. I finished that about 1995, and then I moved into tourism, started taking people on holidays, and the difference between that and rock and roll was if you told people on a holiday that they had to get up early in the morning, they went to bed. Rock and rollers would just stay up all night, then pass out right before wake-up call.
So yeah, just go back to Dred Zeppelin. Just go back to Dred Zeppelin. You guys did quite a lot of touring with those guys, even though probably most people don't know.
Went all over the world. It was something else to see people's reaction to like a reggae version of Stairway to Heaven with Big Fat Elvis singing it. But we had a mosh pit going everywhere. I've actually got some live stuff, and they were brilliant. They were really, really clever and brilliant. We had major artists coming backstage. The main guy from Metallica came to our gig once, and he says, "Okay, where's the truck?" So, what do you mean? What truck? He says, well, you must have a feed out to a truck. You can't possibly get this sound from this equipment. Basically, the guys had a 12-inch amp, 12-inch speaker, a little Fender amp each. And the bass player had a little bass cabinet and drums. And everything was that was it. People couldn't believe they got such a sound from. The whole thing was a put on, but at the same time, it was clever. So
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
a good way for me to go out with rock and roll. I dabbled a bit with some other bands, but I'd peaked. You have to admit, when you don't want to be doing something if you're not into it. And I just didn't want to do another tour to the segment. So I got into tourism and I started going back to cities that we'd toured with bands and realized there was so much more to see. I lately, up until COVID, been doing corporate events where we take people on special trips and the shopping expeditions and museums. And in fact, I've got a thing this weekend, Marina Del Rey, 5 days in Marina Del Rey with a group. So I'm still doing it occasionally, but still got rock and roll in the blood. It's always just under the surface. I tell people, you call me Alan, you get a reasonable and sensible, intelligent conversation. You call me Granny, then there's a chance, anything can happen. So hey,
So you
I'm
got rock and
Granny,
roll.
Alan Granny Grange, the train spotting roadie. Love you, babes.
Thanks, Grant.